So I recently came across an interesting map of Seattle. The map primarily showcases projects that are held up by a process single-family homes are not beholden to. What is this process, and what are the implications it has on the growth of multi-use development? Through a process known as design review, volunteers and city governments are able to review the development of a property. This is not necessarily a Seattle process. In fact, many cities have design review of some kind to regulate the form and aesthetic of buildings. In and of itself, it's a pretty normal thing. The issue of Seattle, though, is that this process is highly unpredictable. As noted by one working group, there are examples where, despite a community highly desiring a certain development to go into their community, the Design Review Board in their infinite wisdom blocks the project, usually on some kind of aesthetic ground, and has them go back for another review, which, as we will soon see, is not cheap at all, nor is it quick. I thought we'd take a look at a few examples to highlight the nature of this process, one which is relatively straightforward, and another example that is much more complex. Firstly, we've got a building on Taylor Avenue North. The Taylor Avenue building is meant to house 220 units in 8 stories and contain a mix of residential, commercial, and storage uses. Oh, and over 300 parking spaces. Sounds fine-ish, right? Well, that's not the first iteration of the project. As we can see, their first draft was submitted in 2018, where the concept instead featured 6 more units and only room for 102 parking spaces. As we can see, it took them 5 years to get a construction permit. Why is this? Well, here is an excerpt from the design document. Ahem. The Taylor Avenue facade requires porosity to ensure an active street experience for the pedestrian. This is the design the architects gave to the concerns of the board in 2020. Personally, I don't see a problem with the first design, which was much closer to the street. If I have to walk or bike from the street through a sea of parking and cars going everywhere, it's a lot less inviting of a place to be than having a building closer to the street. Compared to other buildings nearby that I can see on Google Street View, few have such a setback either. This second building I've got for you is on 1931 2nd Avenue, where a 40-story high-rise is set to be planned for development, but has been kept in limbo for over a decade. They have a land use permit issued in 2009, but supposedly the application for land use has been under review for 13 years, and the construction permit has therefore not been granted. Now again, I'm not from Seattle, but this just feels very excessive. In a city where 75% of land is estimated to be used for single-family housing, allowing more dense development, especially around transit, would only push the price of these things down. It would allow for the market to be a lot more geared towards the average person. You would see more developers putting their stock into, making a 20-story high-rise or a 10-story high-rise for, a working family, maybe. People often ask me why American cities lack the feeling of, verticality. This is kind of why. Over a decade in review, and the property still hasn't received a construction permit. If the people in the community want it, and I'm not sure if they do or don't, but if they do want it, I don't see why they shouldn't have it after 13 years. the people reviewing the document and proposals in 2022 are more than likely not the same as reviewing it in 2008. So I'm sure their tastes and their preferences would be a lot different. If American cities actually want to reduce housing costs and bring themselves out of this idea many people have that they're playgrounds of the rich, the answer is kind of simple. Stop hindering development, encourage density, and reduce the novelty of these buildings. The only reason to me that they're quote-unquote luxury is because we haven't built them in decades. Hey, so you may have seen over the last several weeks and months that I've been experimenting with new content. Today I released a video on design review. Last month, a couple weeks ago, I made a video on the Estonian government, and a couple of weeks prior I made a video on the Hungarian election. I would like to continue this trend of looking at the history of government and government institutions and sort of explain how it is that the institutions we have today came into being. How do you go from a British colonial court system that's frankly barely functioning to the American court system we have today? How do you build out the EPA under a largely Republican administration? How do you, reform a government after a legacy of communism into something of a democracy? That sort of thing. I find that all very interesting, that history of how nations are actually built, because the great man theory is just a theory to me. So with that being said, I appreciate you watching this channel over the last year, and I hope that you will join me in the year to come. Thank you.